In 1931, just 4 years before her death, Corra Harris told friend and editor Hamilton Holt that she wanted to be remembered as someone through whom readers could speak their hearts. That was all she wanted in her last years, and nothing at all afterwards except, quote, to escape the brilliant damnation of modern biographers. She really appreciated biographers who protected, quote, the feelings of the dead. She was really concerned about her legacy. For the roughly 15 years that I've been working on this project, I felt Corra Harris reading over my shoulder, and so I felt obliged to keep one eye on her, trying to honor the feelings of the dead, and one on the here and now, trying equally hard to honor academic integrity and hence the professional life of the living. No wonder the term divided minds made its way into the title. About the title. After Corra Harris and the Divided Mind of the New South came out, and I began receiving invitations to speak, I told a friend I was a little intimidated at the prospect. She didn't get it. "You wrote the book," she said. "Who in the world knows more about Corra Harris than you do?" Well, maybe nobody, although maybe not. I've discovered some living relatives lately. I can't speak with the same confidence, however, about the subject of divided minds, or something as loosely identified as the New South, both of which beg to be challenged. The original title was Corra Harris, Woman of Paradox, but that apparently was not, as they say in the business, sexy enough. Since I preferred to think of my work on Harris as more of a micro-history than a biography, I didn't hesitate when the editor asked me to think of a more broadly appealing title. Titles have never been my forte, though, so I fretted over how to hold on to the central concept of paradox, or contradiction, while capturing something of the historic context. In what I thought was a eureka moment, the current title came to me. It helped that at the time I was using classic Southern text, one of which was Wilbur Cash's Mind of the South, to teach a course on historical methods. So I was thinking of ways to mine that familiar title the way many others have done over the years. When I hit upon Corra Harris and the Divided Mind of the New South, I felt good. How clever. It sounded so clever I was secretly proud. After I got an enthusiastic endorsement from the editor, I felt even more satisfied. Then I realized, when looking up something in another Southern classic, that I had actually lifted the title, The Divided Mind of the New South, right out of C. Van Woodward's Origins of the New South, chapter 6 to be exact. No wonder it sounded so clever. I was mortified. I couldn't decide afterwards whether to pretend that I meant to appropriate Woodward's title or confess that it was more likely a Freudian slip. But it was too late by then. There I was, and here I am with this high-minded title and humbled at trying to live up to it. I'd like to dispense with two things up front, one for her sake and the other for mine. She was adamant about the correct pronunciation of her name. It is pronounced Corra as if it were spelled C-A rather than C-O-R-R-A. Secondly, since people invariably ask how I got interested in the subject, I thought I'd address that inquiry. There are several versions to the story, but I'm sticking to the short one since that's the one I remember best. In 1993, when I was studying for my PhD in East Lansing, I ran across a spirited debate in 1906, the one I think she sat for this picture for. It was a debate on the nature of home, published in the popular periodical The Independent, with Corra Harris defending traditional home and hearth, and Charlotte Gilman challenging everything about tradition. When I discovered Corra Harris was from my home state, I was all at once embarrassed, chagrined, and intrigued. Embarrassed to say that I had not heard of a Georgian so widely published. Chagrined because, at least on the surface, she seemed to stand for just about everything I opposed, and opposed just about everything I'd come to embrace. She seemed hopelessly moralistic and definitely a political dark horse, even for her time. How could I cast my lot with this woman? The more I read, however, the more intrigued I became, discovering how much more there was to her than meets the eye. Indeed, there was her penchant for self-contradiction, which had repelled more than one researcher and sent them running in the other direction. Curiously, however, there was something about that very trait that drew me in. Besides, it was winter in Michigan, and the prospect of being able to return to Georgia to do dissertation research gave me hope. So I proceeded to tackle a topic with which, ever since, I've remained embattled in the most heated love-hate relationship imaginable with a non-living being. For those not familiar with her, let me recall a few biographical details, which I'll preface with an apologetic warning. I've read this part so many times, I should by now be able to recite it without notes. If it lacks enthusiasm, please forgive me. Corra Harris was born Corra May White in 1869 in Elbert County, Georgia. Her formal education was limited to teacher training at female academies, though she never graduated from any of the schools she attended. In 1887, she married Methodist minister and educator Lundy Howard Harris. They had one child survive to adulthood, a daughter she named Faith. For roughly 2 decades, Harris struggled through one personal tragedy after another, through a troubled marriage of 23 years, the loss through death of 2 infant sons, the abandonment and betrayal of her husband in 1898, the scandal and humiliation of his return, and televangelist-like public confessions of adultery, the financial destitution resulting from the loss of his teaching position at Emory College, his suicide in 1910, her daughter's untimely death in 1919, and her sister's death shortly after that. She remained a widow until her death 25 years after her husband's. She outlived her daughter by 16 years. She was, for a time, the most widely known woman from this state. Her reputation during her life and her legacy since then are connected inextricably with the fame associated with A Circuit Rider's Wife, published in 1910. Reputedly autobiographical, the novel is at most a spiritual autobiography, with very little else that resembles her actual life. She wrote more than 24 books, 19 of which were published. 2 were autobiographies, 1 a travel journal, and 2 became feature-length movies. The best known was I'd Climb the Highest Mountain, released in 1951 and inspired by A Circuit Rider's Wife. She published over 200 articles and short stories and well over 1,000 book reviews. She was one of the first women war correspondents to go abroad in World War I. She lived the last 2 decades of her life at the place she named in the Valley in Bartow County, Georgia, where she was living in 1935, the year she died at the age of 65. Speaking of in the Valley, the beautiful pastoral home place of Corra Harris, fast forward from her lifetime back to the future, or today. This is a news flash, by the way. Several years ago, Mr. Jody Hill, Marietta philanthropist and devoted fan and admirer of Corra Harris, bought, and with great care, restored in the Valley as nearly to the way it was during her lifetime as possible. He has generously donated the property to Kennesaw State University. In return, they pledged to maintain the property and dedicate it and other resources to reviving the legacy of Corra Harris and promoting interest in her work. KSU will use the property for retreats and other university and public functions. Even though it goes without saying, I'm going to say it anyway, I regard the whole thing as synchronous and serendipitous. And Dr. Catherine Lewis is here to answer questions about that, I understand, if anyone is interested afterwards. Before I say more about her, I want to quote briefly 3 biographers on the challenge of trying to interpret a life. Actual lives, one wrote, are messy, often boring, and always plotless. Most succinctly of all, Mark Twain captures the challenge in his autobiography where he writes, "What a wee little part of a person's life are his acts and his words. His real life is led in his head. Lastly, one that sets this bio-sketch of Harris in context, another biographer writes, "The unstated premise of biography is the uniqueness of the life in question, the conviction that a certain quality in this individual makes this particular life worth reading." There is plenty about Corra Harris that makes her worth reading. Her actual life may have been messy at times and often appeared plotless, but one thing she never was, and that was boring. She was a very complex and complicated woman, brilliant in some respects, deeply insightful in others, conflicted in still others. If I had to summarize the book in a few lines, I would say that it's chiefly an interpretation of Corra Harris's intellectual development. Although the point about what constitutes one's real life is arguable, and postmodernists would have a field day with this simplistic preference, I believe nonetheless, with Mark Twain, that the real life is in the mind, and I would add, as did Harris, in the heart. That was the approach she took in her 2-volume autobiography, the first titled My Book in Heart, and the second, As a Woman Thinks. I didn't consciously adopt her approach, but it somehow turned out that way. In any case, I have argued that besides history, geography, heredity, demographics, or any other factors that influence human development, 4 in particular shaped Corra Harris. They were: 1, the religious extremes of her mother and her husband; 2, the tragic losses she suffered in her middle years; 3, the epiphany she had in 1899, a spiritual transformation that led her to a conclusion forbidden to women at the time, namely that to survive she's going to have to think for herself; and lastly, her close association with editor Paul Elmer More at a pivotal point in her development. Of those factors, I believe that the first 2, the losses and the religious excesses of her mother and husband, though trying in the short term, paid rich dividends in the long term. The losses catalyzed and sustained her writing career, and the religious excesses of Mary White and Lundy Harris led her to seek balance, albeit outside the church and organized religion. The remaining 2 influences, the life-altering experience in 1899 and her association with Paul Moore shortly afterward, were at opposite ends of the spectrum, with the influence of the former representing the best of who she was, and that of Paul Moore the worst. I hope I have demonstrated, because I certainly believe, her life was a hard-fought battle between the warring values and belief systems that derived from both those experiences, one personally liberating and the other personally binding. If she didn't do it to herself, I might feel like a traitor calling Harris a contradiction, since that could mean any number of questionable things. It could support the stereotype of women as fickle and indecisive. It could suggest a character flaw. It could suggest someone who didn't know her own mind. I intend none of that, but she cannot escape the commonly held opinion that she was a woman characterized by contradiction. Many who knew or read Corra Harris came to just that conclusion, but no one said it better than she. I do not know what God could have been thinking about when he made me, she writes. Such a lie. A being whose outside is an absolute contradiction to her inside, whose every action is a concealment of truth, who can never be veracious except when she is writing fiction. End quote. The subject of Harris's fiction I cover in Chapter 7. Just as she defied tradition in her life, I did so in my interpretation of her life. In other words, I organized the book thematically rather than chronologically. In the introduction, I aimed to show how Harris's apparently contradictory nature was as much a reflection of her time and place as it was an expression of a unique individual. An excerpt from a letter she wrote in 1903 about tragic experiences in her life a few years earlier captures the point. It is especially poignant if we think of her life before and after the pivotal year 1899 as a microcosm of the old and the New South, with a cataclysmic war in between. In the old days, she wrote, when I was just a little feminine creation in my home in Oxford, I was not happy, but I was very simple. Then the shock came, her husband's abandonment and the family's destitution, and I was thrust into the strange world of a new life, a writing career. The world I knew went out in one lightning fizzle, and although I escaped on the ladder, I can't come down again because I cannot trust the ground, and I can't go up because I'm not finished, end quote. Her description of being trapped on a ladder, escaping from one phase of life to another, recalls a passage from Daniel Single about the thinking Southerner at the turn of the century being, quote, trapped in an intellectual no man's land between the thought of two centuries. It was difficult, if not impossible, for sensitive thinking people of her day not to have divided minds. I titled the chapter that treats the traditional biographical details of Harris's life, Family and Tragedy in the Development of Corra Harris. Even if much of hers was a tragic life, she was never a tragic person. John Talmadge, another biographer, described her as a lady of purpose. He meant she was determined, for what he implied was mostly self-interest. But that captures only a small part of her character and personality. She was indeed driven, perhaps at times by self-interest, but she wound up financially supporting not only her immediate family, but supplementing the income of her extended family, including her father, her sister's family of 5, and her grown daughter after she married. Corra Harris was many things to many people. First and foremost, she was a survivor. Although many of her writings reveal someone who nostalgically and naively recalls the past and blindly reveres tradition, her reality forced her beyond tradition, and she became a woman who looked ahead instead of behind for direction. She was also very practical-minded, a shrewd businesswoman, in some ways a no-nonsense kind of person, sentimental about very little except her immediate family. She could be mirthful, a prankster, with a very active sense of humor. She could be boldly self-assertive. She could be humbly self-effacing. She could be, as she said, superstitiously reverent toward authority in one breath and scandalously defy authority in the next. She could also be deeply spiritual, if not, perhaps surprisingly, religious. No matter the circumstance, she never defaulted to self-pity. In the manner, if not the morals, of that fictional vixen, Scarlett O'Hara, Corra Harris again was a determined survivor. She was also a notoriously bad speller, and famous for never letting the facts get in her way of making whatever point she wanted to make. She loved dogs, she smoked cigarettes, she often swore, and she had a very short temper, a short fuse, a temper that was legendary. And she'd be the first to admit all that, both good and bad. Besides being contradictory, honest self-critique was one of her most charming and disarming traits. There was nothing anyone could say about her that escaped her self-awareness. She frequently disarmed critics by anticipating their criticism and humbly agreeing with it, or simply by admitting publicly her shortcomings and limitations. Quite interestingly to me, in her last years, that included awareness of cultural prejudices. Corra probably would have credited her father with modeling the mix of humility and self-confidence required of the sort of self-critique she exhibited. She wrote often in her early career about her parents, Tinsley White and Mary Matthews White. Her father was known for his wit, histrionics, and love of strong drink. Her mother for traits considered nearly the opposite. Mary White was sober, humorless, and gravely religious. She would, quote, die at the stake for a creed or a doctrine. And she bore her husband's sin of drinking like a personal cross. Harris appreciated her father's wit, and she respected her mother's single-focused dedication to her faith. But she preferred her father's visceral religion to her mother's emotionless zeal. Harris describes her relationship with her parents as amicable, if not intimate. She sought in some ways to emulate her father and love and respect her mother from a distance. Corra's choice of marriage partner gives credence to what psychologists say about people choosing to marry someone to work out issues unresolved with their parents. Lundy Harris embodied the excesses of Tinsley and Mary White without the psychological resources of either. In other words, like Tinsley, he was drawn to alcohol, but with a much lower threshold for tolerance. Like Mary, Lundy was deeply religious. Unlike Mary, a fairly uncomplicated person who never questioned a belief, Lundy was a deep thinker who questioned everything, especially everything religious. Unfortunately for him, the times did not suffer the questioning gently. One writer calls it the spiritual crisis of the Gilded Age. Beset with a volatile temperament, Lundy never learned how to call a truce in his thinking in the war between orthodoxy and modern ways of interpreting God. Over time, he lost any certitude about anything he felt or believed. Lundy was a Methodist minister and a classically trained educator. He was brilliant and handsome, exceedingly popular, whether in the pulpit or in the classroom. But he was given to all manner of extremes and temperamental excesses. He was possibly manic depressive, but he was surely unbalanced, suffering from a mood disorder. At his best, the last 10 years of his life, he was melancholy. At his worst, he was suicidal. Unfortunately, he considered his depressive moods a sign of God's disapproval. This led him from bouts of indulgent excesses on the one hand to bouts of ascetic contrition on the other. The swings caused Corra unending embarrassment and finally cost Lundy his life. Moreover, his volatility ultimately placed the family's financial well-being onto Corra. Like so many women historically, she kept her family together through writing to survive. Their daughter Faith, although a temperamental facsimile of her father, thankfully to Corra, did not adopt his religious intensity. Though not without its problems, her relationship with her daughter, in the balance, brought satisfaction. The problems came after Faith married Harry Leach, a man who did not care for Corra, and vice versa. He didn't like women with opinions. And while she didn't want Faith to marry anybody, certainly not a man she believed as unsuited as Harry Leach to make a decent living. Corra spent her mothering years first trying to shield Faith from Lundy's religious eccentricities, and then trying to teach her how to cope more reasonably with her inherited temperament. After Lundy's death, she spent Faith's married life trying to stay in contact with her daughter against her son-in-law's wishes. They lived the last 4 years of Faith's life with Corra and Harry estranged and Faith torn in the middle. In spite of the tense situation, mother and daughter remained connected. Faith became her mother's best friend and confidant, and Corra her daughter's mainstay. The acrimony between Corra and Harry, furthermore, was on the mend after 9 tenuous years of the young couple's married life. Faith was at the beginning of a promising career as a writer when she died unexpectedly of an undisclosed illness in 1919. Corra had not recovered from the death of her daughter, Faith, when 2 years later, Hope Harris, her sister, and incidentally, sister-in-law, died. Lundy's death in 1910 had stilled Corra and actually strengthened her faith. The loss of daughter Faith, 9 years later, and sister Hope, 2 years after that, brought the deepest crisis of faith of her life. Faith and hope, literally and spiritually, had left her. It was devastating and caused her to question deeply the spiritual certitude that had before governed her interior life. The 2-volume autobiography that followed over the next 2 years proved to be a therapeutic catharsis that helped pull her through. Afterward, Corra devoted the remaining years of her life to writing and to her beloved home in the valley. With the help of Betty and Trenny Raines, two young neighborhood girls who eventually moved in with Harris, the Valley became, in the last decade of her life, a hub of entertainment for local, state, and regional celebrities. Readers of my book with whom I have spoken have all expressed surprise at the influence editor Paul Moore had on her. Moore was a brilliant, Harvard-educated scholar, literary critic, editor, and chief mentor of Corra Harris. He was a towering intellectual presence during his productive years. He had impressive credentials, a highly respected reputation, and more to the point, a reactionary philosophy that proved morally bankrupt. Scarcely can one find in a single body of work evidence for obvious outcomes from an intellectual system than one finds in Moore's work. He and others called their philosophy the, quote, new humanism, to distinguish it from what they believed was a brand of humanitarianism they loathed. In effect, the new humanism turned out to be a rigid, unyielding, dispassionate philosophy and deeply disillusioning to those who adopted it, including Paul Moore himself. Suffice it to say, and this is essential and I hope clear and convincing in the book, I believe Moore's influence ultimately retarded Harris's intellectual growth, catalyzed and exacerbated many of the contradictions we find in her writing, and short-circuited her ability to reconcile more fully those resulting contradictions. Harris and Moore co-authored a book together and corresponded during the early years of her career, from 1901 to 1904. She read nearly as gospel everything he wrote. That included volumes on moral philosophy, literary criticism, and the nature of human nature, which was to him base and irrefutably gendered. She learned to interpret both literature and life through his philosophical prism. Some speculated that she may have felt more than strong admiration for him, that she may secretly have been in love with him. Perhaps. It's impossible to tell conclusively from the correspondence. Depends on who's interpreting. In any case, smitten or not, it was a platonic love since their paths crossed with rare exception only in the males. Not that I'm not curious about such things, but my chief concern was with the way he shaped her thinking, which was decidedly not for the good. Her thinking on issues of gender, class, and race demonstrates the point. Until the last few years of her life, as often as she could get away with it, she dodged what she considered explicitly political subjects. She preferred, she said, to write about matters of the heart, as though the two could be so neatly separated. Some of her writings reveal that she implicitly understood that politics, especially gender politics, and matters of the heart are not separate, but rather interwoven as part of a bigger picture. Her writings on issues of class evolved very little. She generally romanticized the rural poor and demonized the urban poor. During the Depression, however, she tended to demonize all poor in reaction to the New Deal policies of the one she called Robin Hood Roosevelt. Her thinking on race was much less straightforward, much more complicated. Two things make the point. New York editors launched her writing career in 1899 by publishing an impassioned editorial she wrote defending lynching. Yet, she wrote rather boldly in a 1905 review of Souls of Black Folk that she believed W.E.B. Du Bois a much better choice as leader for his race than Booker T. Washington. A truly radical statement. Truly, though one finds deeply embedded prejudice about race in her works, one also finds her struggling to come to terms with racial justice. She's set apart on the issue by the fact that she was not willing to linger in the comfortable space of paternalism the way her reputedly progressive contemporaries were. At the risk of attributing overmuch insight to her, I'm suggesting that, although Harris did not have the language or everyday experience to think in terms of social equality, she did have the spiritual values, or, to put it in more academic terms, Harris illustrates the difference between what philosopher Martha Nussbaum calls teaching tolerance and cultivating humanity. Tolerance alone, once a laudable goal, has taught us that it has its limits. Harris may have intuited as much when she bypassed paternalism and attempted, in her mature years, to craft a philosophy of human relations based upon egalitarian spiritual values. Harris's thinking on gender was the most entertaining to study, not because it was easy, but it was rewarding to watch someone reason her way out of illogical thinking, or to use a favorite pedagogical term, to watch her think herself right out of the box, on rare occasions, way out of the box. Moreover, it seems better to describe her thinking on gender as more confused than contradictory. Her insights at times could be stunningly astute. In the midst of reading what comes across as a worn-out, banal defense of Victorian domesticity, suddenly appears a stark critique of patriarchy. It's a jolt, one that likely slipped by most of her contemporaries, but it was enough to hook me in the early days and turn this project into something of a crusade to find where and how those rays of light broke through. There are no time for examples of that, but they're in the book. Yet, in spite of rare but striking insights, she had serious misgivings about gender identity, her own and that of all women. Her lamentations on the subject haunt as much as they baffle. She had the same passionate love-hate relationship with her work that most writers have. Writing was her salvation and her albatross. It was the most effective coping strategy she used to work through tragedy in her middle years and loneliness in her later life. She wrote once that, quote, "It's easier to be a Christian than a successful writer." A particularly entertaining passage on the subject comes from a letter she wrote to Faith. "You have my prayers and sympathy this coming week with your work," she writes. "I hope it will go, but if it does, it'll be the first time in the literary history of the family that work ever took up its bed and walked off without a deadly struggle with the author." She also had the same strong misgivings that plague many writers, and she was forever needing approval and reassurance from her editors to validate it. No matter how much fame and fan mail she received, she never overcame those misgivings. A letter to an editor captures the point. "The thing I cannot understand," she wrote in her last years, "is how I produce the impression of being a formidable old ass dedicated to the propagation of my own conceit when I'm the humblest of writers when it comes to judging my own copy. I'm so stricken with the consciousness of my limitations that I rewrite it over and over in a sweat of despair because it never is as good as it should be." To Atlanta Journal editor John Pascal, such self-awareness was arguably the truest evidence of her greatness. Harris, he noted, quote, spoke and wrote of herself and her work as naively as a child. She had an honesty and integrity and fearless mind that analyzed her own life and personality with the same frankness that she interpreted the people about her, end quote. She could be very hard on herself. She judged herself most harshly for harshly judging others. About her own internal critic, she wrote, "I've spent nearly 50 years striving to outlaw the critic in me, only to find that he frequently gets up before I do and never retires at all so long as I'm sufficiently wakeful to think. Seems to be constantly engaged in the effort to build me up too much at the expense of my fellow men and women." End quote. It was because of this internal critic that she prayed most often for a clean heart and a right spirit, which is the subject of the final chapter about Harris's eclectic spiritual values. In the writings of her mature years, one finds a healthy questioning that derived most directly from her egalitarian spiritual values. And I believe they ultimately trumped if they did not totally displace the hierarchical values inherited from Southern tradition and underwritten by Paul Moore. If her antebellum sisters, as Anne Scott tells us, referenced the biblical passage from Jeremiah about the heart being deceitful above all else, Harris shifted the focus to the psalmist's prayer for a clean heart and a renewed spirit. Why did she believe she needed a clean heart? To fulfill the other command she referenced often those last years, the one to love one's neighbor as oneself. And there is evidence to show that she meant neighbors across the globe as well as across the valley. But there was little in the political discourse of her day to articulate an egalitarian vision. So when she posed the questions to her understanding of whom and what God was, there she found a premise that better suited her search for meaning, peace, and contentment. By that time, she had come to own what she learned was the key to the elusive happiness she sought all her life. Namely, she felt peace when she felt she fulfilled the biblical command to love others, all others, as herself. In the last months of her life, correspondence between Harris and close friends shows a woman physically ill but emotionally content. Knowing her days were numbered, she wrote a friend that her heart, quote, has turned to the asp in my bosom. Physically, I feel like a sick kitten on a hot brick, but mentally I am in a state of high meridian serenity, feeling that courage I have felt before in the presence of the inevitable, and a truly devilish satisfaction in the record I have made in using up all the horsepower of life and energy in doing my own will and my own work, end quote. In the end, nothing in life was more vital to Harris than being able to do her own will and her own work. She said she wanted to, quote, die with the 7-league boots of my mind on. Even though gravely ill, she wrote until just days before her death, February the 9th, 1935. There was enough copy to continue publishing her famed candlelit column for weeks afterward. After working on this project for nearly 15 years, I wondered how it would feel to have it finished. Would the love-hate relationship be reconciled? Would I feel that coveted sense of closure? Would I ever feel that the payoff was worth the seemingly endless investment of time and frustrated interruptions to completing it? In a sense, I guess the jury's still out on that. I'm holding my breath, so to speak, for the reviews. In the meantime, besides the fortuitous publicity surrounding the transfer of her property, one other thing has made this stage of this long journey deeply gratifying. Knowing that there is no one better qualified to answer, because arguably no one else alive knows more about her, with a bit of trepidation, and with her words about escaping the damnation of modern biographers and protecting the feelings of the dead ever in mind, I asked Mr. Jody Hill, the recent donor of her home place and one of her most devoted fans, the loaded question, do you think Corra would approve of the book? After a very pregnant pause, he answered, yes, I think she would. After a sigh, equally as long as his pregnant pause, I exhaled. At least for a moment, reviews be damned, I felt I had wrung a victory. She can, I hope, rest in peace, and I can finally say, to borrow from her biblical nomenclature, it is finished, and I, for one, am mightily relieved. Thank you.